When you think about witches, you might think of Hermione Granger or the Salem witch trials, but you probably don't picture airplane pilots systematically annihilating Nazis under the cover of darkness. And yet, that's exactly who the Night Witches were, an all-female group of Soviet pilots who terrorized the German front lines in World War II. And I'm willing to bet that you probably haven't heard of them. Especially outside of Russia, their story has been long left in the shadows of history. Hello, I'm your host RJ McLaughlin, and this is The History Show, where we unearth some of the weirdest, grittiest, most bananas, sometimes literally bananas, madcap, forgotten, how the heck did we not learn this in school type of stories. And to put it frankly, the story of the Night Witches, the one I'm about to tell you, is awesome. And I cannot wait to share it with you. Welcome to The History Show. To really uncover the story, we need to go back to 1938, just 1 year before World War II began in Europe, specifically to the Soviet Union, and a woman named Marina Raskova. And while she wasn't technically one of the Night Witches, she was the one who set their legend into motion. At the time, promoting women was a core part of an effort to align gender equality with the Soviet Union's broader socialist identity. Powerful leaders, Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, encouraged women to do things like pursue education and join the workforce. But this push wasn't purely progressive so much as it was strategic propaganda. Still, despite ulterior motives, many Soviet women took these opportunities to push past real barriers, and one of the most notable among them was our dear badass Marina Raskova. Raskova was a decorated navigator and pilot who set a bunch of aviation records in the USSR, one of the most famous being her long-distance flight record in 1938, which was the longest nonstop flight by an all-female crew at the time. On this flight, they flew for 26 hours straight and covered around 4,000 miles in terrible conditions over bare wilderness with no civilization in sight. Also, I was gonna make a joke about how small the bathrooms were on the plane, because I was like, oh, they gotta be small, right? Turns out they didn't have any. They didn't have bathrooms on the plane they were flying for more than a day. Regardless, when I tell you how this journey ended, you'll understand why she ultimately inspired a platoon of Nazi hunters. Essentially, as they approached the 26-hour mark, their fuel was running low, and with bad weather and low visibility, they were unable to find a proper landing site. It looked like they were gonna crash land in the woods, so to save on weight and for her safety, Raskova was forced to eject from the plane and landed in the middle of the taiga, while the other two on board, the pilot in command, Valentina Grizadubova, and the co-pilot, Polina Osipenko, performed a crash landing in the woods. Fortunately, all three women survived, which is wow. But Raskova, who ejected and was separated from the group, spent 10 days alone in the Siberian wilderness. During this time, the only form of communication she had with her crew was from gunshots, which we think they were using to help determine their location, which is such a great idea. But before she was able to find them, Raskova was fortunately spotted and rescued by a pilot who was flying overhead as a part of a massive search party and was later reunited with her crewmates. Once back in Moscow, Raskova and her crew were welcomed with open arms. Parades were thrown for them. There was widespread media coverage. I mean, Stalin himself not only welcomed them back, but hosted a dinner to celebrate them where he sat next to Raskova. Now let's just hold on for a second. Could you imagine sitting next to Stalin at dinner? You know, the dude who orchestrated forced famines, mass executions, and deportations, killing millions in the process? What do you say to that guy at dinner? Stalin, do you want to split that last potato with me? Oh, you were planning on having it all to yourself? Oh yeah, no, you're good. I get it. Yeah, you don't like sharing that kind of stuff that's yours? Yeah. No, I get you. Cool. Sorry, what were we talking? Oh yeah, so basically, there was no bathroom. But I suppose for these women, showing up for dinner was just another show of their fierce bravery. Still, there was overwhelming support for them. And on top of all this, all three were given the Hero of the Soviet Union award, becoming the first women to ever do so. They became celebrities overnight and inspired so many young women and girls within the Soviet Union. And as you can imagine, this level of popularity and praise also gave them many connections to high-ranking officials. Though it is a strange contradiction when you think about it. I mean, these women were so celebrated, and yet today, most people outside of Russia haven't even heard of them. Really raises the bigger question to me of who gets remembered in history and why. Regardless, around 1 year later, the USSR enters World War II. And even in just a year, the culture was shifting. When the call was put out for soldiers after Germany invaded in 1941, Raskova and many other women like her stepped up, ready to defend their country. But in the lead up to entering the war, Stalin had started rolling back his initial support and emphasis on gender equality, which kind of shows how hollow it really was. So these decorated pilots and aviators were turned away because now women weren't allowed to join the Air Force, even though they were allowed to be on the front lines in the Army as a doctor or nurse or anti-aircraft gunner or communications operator. They still weren't able to fly planes for the USSR. So even though Raskova was one of the most celebrated aviators of the time, they told her she would be more useful as a flight instructor, someone to help stay behind and train the men. Because clearly that makes more sense. Raskova found this absurd, and in fall 1941, just a few months into the USSR's fight against Germany, she decided to do something about it. The story goes that she used her connections to get a meeting with Stalin, someone she already knew admired her, and somehow, some way, she convinced this dangerous man fairly quickly that women should be allowed to enlist as combat pilots. In a famous speech on September 8th, 1941, Raskova demanded, quote, "The Soviet woman. She is the hundreds of thousands of drivers, tractor operators, and pilots who are ready at any moment to sit down in a combat machine and plunge into battle. Dear sisters, the hour has come for harsh retribution. Stand in the ranks of the warriors for freedom." Now, if that's what she said over the radio, I can't imagine what she said in the room. But the fact that Raskova convinced Stalin, of all people, to sign off on women flying into battle, that alone is extraordinary. Nonetheless, Raskova got the go-ahead, and 3 all-female air regiments were created. These regiments became the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. This is the one we will be focusing on in this video. And inspired by Raskova and her comrades, thousands of women, most of whom were already experienced in aviation, applied and were interviewed, with only around 400 being accepted into the regiments. One of these women was Yevdokia Bershinskaya, a 28-year-old pilot and instructor who would go on to command the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Bershinskaya and around 400 other women were sent to training at an aviation school along the Volga River. Here they were taught everything they needed to know about military aviation thanks to Raskova. However, along with their grueling education, the women were also met with setbacks and hazing from their male counterparts. We can see in interviews from the crew stating things like how the uniforms they were forced to wear were made for men, so they were forced to walk around in clothes and shoes that didn't fit. Other times the men would just straight up make fun of the female students for being less experienced. And to make matters worse, specifically the 588th Bomber Regiment was stuck using these planes called PO-2s. These were like the worst planes ever. The PO-2s were originally built in the late 1920s as a training aircraft used in flight schools and aviation clubs, but when World War II broke out and resources ran thin, the Soviet military requisitioned these old training planes and brought them to the front lines. They were essentially just canvas stapled to wood with a lawnmower engine on it. That would be my best way of describing it. They were also open cockpit with no additional gear other than 4 bomb racks they had mounted onto the wings. Like early on, they didn't even fly with parachutes. In a plane made of wood and fabric. They also carried flare bombs in their laps that illuminated the target below so they could aim. And to deploy these, all they had to do was drop them by hand out of their moving open cockpit plane. Meanwhile, the other 2 regiments were flying much more advanced aircraft, such as the Yak fighters and the PE-2 dive bombers, mainly because they were directly involved in the fighting. Now, these 2 regiments would go on to contribute to the war effort in very critical ways, but it wasn't them who would go on to haunt Nazi forces. No, it was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, who in June 1942, under Bershinskaya's command, launched their first ever mission in their creaky, fabric-covered PO-2 biplanes. However, they used the plane to its strengths, flying incredibly low and incredibly slow to get close and avoid detection. On their first mission, the 588 flew 3 planes, each completing single sorties, which are just low-altitude bombing runs, under complete darkness. They did these sorties 3 to 5 minutes apart, one after another, just constantly rotating. The process would look a little something like this. Each plane flew towards its target at incredibly low speed and height, though no lower than 400 meters, because otherwise fragments of their own bombs would hit the plane. And just before reaching the Nazi encampment, they would cut their engines, an incredibly dangerous move, gliding silently through the air, making them virtually impossible to detect. Once over their targets, the women would drop their flare bomb out of the cockpit, the one that they had been holding in their lap, to illuminate the sky just long enough for them to aim and drop their bombs, wreaking absolute havoc and tearing through Nazi supply stations, equipment, and troops. So even though they were given these old wooden biplanes that weren't built for combat, these ingenious women used them to their advantage. Because the PO-2s were so slow, the much faster German planes struggled to actually target them. The Nazis just weren't prepared for this kind of attack. Now, this is still war, and war is steeped in loss and tragedy. One of the 3 planes didn't return home from that first mission. But for a debut flight in underpowered, outdated aircraft against one of the most powerful armies in the world, they did a pretty dang good job in my opinion. Following this first mission, the 588 quickly built up a menacing reputation. Night after night, they launched relentless bombing runs, sometimes executing between 80 and 90 sorties in a single evening. Their goal wasn't just destruction, it was exhaustion. They struck when the Nazis least expected it, after the fighting in the dead of night, targeting supply depots and resting encampments, often in complete silence. The only sound being the soft whoosh of the wind slipping through the wooden wings of the PO-2 biplanes. For Nazi troops, sleep became something they could only dream of. The effect was psychological as much as it was physical. This fear gave the regiment its name, but not by the Soviets. It was the Nazis who, after hearing the bombers were women, started calling them Nachthexen, or the Night Witches. When Soviet intelligence caught wind of this nickname, they ran with it. The women became national heroes back home. They were written about in newspapers, they were on the front page of magazines. Things were going great. But in the midst of all this, tragedy struck. On January 4th, 1943, Marina Raskova, the regiment's founder and the very woman who had fought to make female combat pilots a reality, died in a plane crash while en route to the Stalingrad front. Her death sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union, and she was given the first state funeral of the war, showing really how respected she was by her nation. Within the regiments, her loss was felt deeply. For many women, Raskova was more than just a navigator and pilot, she was a symbol. But with her gone, things seemed kind of up in the air. Many thought that without Raskova around, the unit might get disbanded altogether. But in situations like these, the only thing you can really do is keep going. And that's exactly what the Night Witches did. Under Bershinskaya's leadership, the Night Witches supported nearly every major Soviet offensive they could, including the Crimean Offensive, Operation Bagration in Belarus, and the East Prussian Offensive. In each of these, they did what they did best: harass the enemy relentlessly. They bombed supply lines, transport routes, and sleeping encampments, keeping Nazi troops awake and on edge night after night. Over the course of World War II, they carried out over 23,000 sorties in 3 years. That's an average of 21 sorties a day for 3 years straight. Even as 1945 rolled around and the war was nearing its end, the Night Witches kept flying, right up until the Allies officially declared victory over the Axis powers. After the war ended in May, the Night Witches were honored back in the Soviet Union, with 10 crews participating in the August Victory Parade in Moscow. But as October rolled around and the need for the regiment dwindled, the 588 was dissolved. And despite years of service and sacrifice, many of these women were expected, and to be fair, some of them wanted to just return back to their pre-war lives, as if nothing ever happened. Most men continued on in military service, but most women were sent home and banned from service academies, which was pretty much the only way to become a military pilot or officer. Now, a small few of these women did get direct recognition for their service. 24 out of the 261 Night Witches got the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, which at the time was the highest military honor you could get. Others got various smaller awards like the Order of the Red Banner, Order of the Patriotic War, Order of the Red Star, and the Order of Lenin. But for the most part, they were overlooked, especially outside of the Soviet Union. For decades after the war, the story of the Night Witches remained largely untold outside of the Soviet Union, mainly because of the Cold War. Since the USSR quickly shifted from ally to enemy after the war, in the US and much of the West, the Soviets' contribution to World War II, including what the Night Witches did, was downplayed. But that began to change in the mid-1980s when Belarusian author Svetlana Alexievich, who would go on to win a Nobel Prize, published The Unwomanly Face of War, an oral history compiled from hundreds of interviews with Soviet women who served in World War II. It was groundbreaking, and while the Night Witches aren't specifically mentioned, it helped open the door to Soviet women's war stories, especially back in the USSR. And over the years, as former Soviet archives became more accessible, their story reached farther, leading to A Dance with Death, Soviet Airwomen in World War II in 1994. In this book, author Anne Nagel traveled to Russia and interviewed a handful of the surviving Night Witches, documenting their story in full. This compounded in the following years when more books and academic papers were published, like Wings, Women in War by Raina Pennington in 2001 and Defending the Motherland by Luba Vinogradova in 2015, all influential in the promotion of this story. Now, none of these books made the Night Witches global celebrities overnight, but they certainly helped open the door to bring their voices back into the conversation. I mean, it's the reason I first heard about the Night Witches. Before, when I thought about women in World War II, my mind went to the experience of women in the US, icons like Rosie the Riveter, or women supporting the war effort from home by working in factories or starting victory gardens. But there is so much more to this side of history that we still haven't unpacked, like the other 800,000 Soviet women who served in the Red Army, or the Women Air Force Service Patrol in the US who supported the war by ferrying test planes. There's just so much more to unearth. And we're still unearthing today. In 2025, the New York Times dropped an article documenting the life of overlooked Night Witch Polina Gelman, who we didn't even touch on in this story. I'll leave a link to that article in the description. I highly recommend you check it out. Basically, what I'm getting at is some of the most incredible stories aren't necessarily hidden. They're just waiting for someone to start looking. Thank you to everybody who helped make this episode. If you have any other buried historical stories you want us to dig up, let us know in the comments. If you see other stories you like below, you can upvote them and we'll add them to our ever-growing list of topics. Also, if you want to see what we're up to, you can join the Complexly newsletter by visiting complexly.com. I'm RJ McLaughlin. Have a great rest of your day.